When talking about the materials used for the creation of jewelry, sustainability often gets mentioned, but few people really know how multifaceted sustainability is, and as a result, we are surrounded by greenwashing, making it even more confusing for anyone in the industry and our customers to understand exactly what is and is not a sustainable investment. It is, however, really great that the sentiments underpinning sustainability are not only becoming more and more important to us all, they can be a real catalyst for innovation and greater care in jewelry brands. My guest has dedicated a large proportion of her career to the subject. She's founded her own brand in 2006 to pilot a sustainable business model promoting positive ethics in mining and jewelry. And following many requests for consultancy, she now specializes in responsible sourcing and the route to market of precious metals, diamonds, and gems, with international assignments taking her around the world. For the BAJ podcast today, I'm excited to welcome subject matter expert Vivien Johnston Glass. Welcome, Vivien.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Vivien, to start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Absolutely. So I'm an independent consultant, a subject matter expert, and a responsible sourcing specialist. I've got over 20 years of experience working in global supply chains, specifically in precious minerals. And I suppose I could be described as perhaps an agent of change. So, in your introduction, Sophie, you kindly mentioned the fact that I'd founded my own jewellery business. That was back in 2006. I founded a business called Fifi Bijou, which was really the first commercial jewellery brand that was working with the aspirations, I suppose, of having an entirely responsible supply chain and going from the mines all the way through in every single product that I created, and working for traceability, working for transparency, but moreover, working for inclusiveness of some of the small scale mining communities and some of the really brilliant projects which exist, and trying to sort of really bring them into an aspirational product. So that was how it all started. And from there, I became a consultant. I worked for GEMA for a number of years as well as their ethics manager, and held various different leadership roles with boutique consultancies. I've worked with some of the most iconic jewellery brands and delivered measurable outcomes throughout my career.
Before we dive deeper into this section of your career, can I ask you what attracted you to the subject of jewelry in the first place?
I think really going back to things when I was very young, when I was a child, I was one of those, I still am one of those people who my brain is always very busy. And in order to quieten it down and just give myself a little bit of escape, a little bit of rest sometimes, I found that craft activities as well as dancing, those were the two things that if I just needed a little bit of headspace, those two things I could become really absorbed in. And I loved making things, and I was, I suppose, a little bit of a magpie. I loved sparkly things, and yeah, I just enjoyed the sort of process of thinking about designing things and making things. But actually, I was going to be a sculptor, and I spoke to my father about this. I was applying for art school. I studied at Glasgow School of Art, and before I applied, I sat with my dad and I said, I want to go and I want to go to art school. It's always been something I've been very interested to do, and I want to study sculpture. He said, no. What do you mean no? And he said, you need to think about your future. I want you to have a career that you can support yourself, and that you're not basically going to live from me for the rest of your life. You're going to have something that you can actually have as a career that you can live from. Think again. So off I went and thought again, and came back a few days later, and I said, what about if I was to study jewellery making and silversmithing? Because it's a bit like sculpture, it's three-dimensional. I still get to make things, I still get to think creatively, but it's got an intrinsic value. And I thought he was just going to say, turn around and go and think again. But no, he sat and thought about it and he said, yeah, okay, all right. So that was it. So I applied, very fortunate. I got into Glasgow School of Art and studied there for 4 years. So that was how I started off. I became head of design for a commercial jewellery company after I graduated. Didn't immediately come out and become head of design. I just want to clarify that. That would be nice. But as a graduate, no, I came out and I became, a junior designer, and then I worked my way up. So within 5 years, I was head of design. And from there, I started sourcing, actually more looking at quality control. So we had an issue, it all came back to this actually. We had an issue with our blue topaz, and some of our retailers were complaining that when the products were placed in the windows, the blue topaz was turning white. Well, this was very curious. So I was intrigued and I wanted to find out more. And we were working with suppliers in Thailand at the time. So I was going back and forward. So I sort of worked my way through the supply chain. It turned out, as we now know, that this irradiation of blue topaz can be reversed, I think, with UV light. So I think that was probably that instability that we were observing there. But it also led me further into thinking about who our suppliers were, and not just our immediate suppliers, but further back in the supply chain, and trying to sort of produce an approved supplier list. At that point, I didn't know what I was doing was really called an audit. I now do those regularly with putting together, who are your suppliers? Let's check what the capacity of those suppliers are, the capability, and obviously all the due diligence and responsible sourcing around that. So I started building that into that particular company in a very organic way. But it fascinated me, and to the extent that I became uncomfortable when I didn't know things, and there was so much that I just couldn't find out. There was so many barriers, particularly with colour gems, but actually in almost every aspect of the supply chain at that point. This is back in the sort of mid-2000s. So by 2006, I had come up with the concept of having my own brand, which allowed me to explore these issues and sort of pilot how far can I take this model of transparency, this model of traceability. I knew I couldn't do it under the existing company because that was an established brand, and it was almost too risky really for them to start to play too much with their supply chain. But for me, I thought, let's try this. At that point, I was young, free and single. I didn't have any real responsibilities other than a dog, and I thought, let's do it. So I launched the brand Fifi Bijou, and that's where it all started. And I learned so much, really, walk the walk as far as responsible sourcing goes. And I was lucky to be invited by the World Bank to go and speak in Washington, DC. And that was for a project which was community and small scale mining, or CHASM. And I think a lot of people in the industry that are as old as me will probably remember that very exciting dialogue that was taking place between some of the world's biggest gold miners and diamond producers, but also with the artisanal small scale miners, the NGOs. Really everyone was in the room at that point, and we were having great collaborative conversations, and there was a real energy around it. And sadly, after a few years, the funding ran out and it wasn't renewed. So that project came to an end. But in that time, I absolutely made the most of those opportunities, and I was traveling to Brazil and looking at the gold mines there, stayed in one of the mining sites for a little while and really got to know the workings of it. Had the opportunity to go to Mongolia, somewhere that I never would have dreamed of going, but so much fascinating information and people. And that's what really built it up for me, was this is about human supply chains. This isn't just about materials. These are about relationships. These are about, it's about people. So yeah, that was sort of how it all came to be, and the sort of transition, I suppose, from me thinking that I wanted to go into something to do with jewellery wasn't entirely clear. I wanted to design, and then from there it sort of progressed into different directions, I suppose.
It's really fascinating to hear that one person sort of, well, obviously your dad has an important role anyway in how you turn out, but for him to sort of direct you, if he would have just said yes, you could have had a totally different career. It's quite an interesting thing to ponder.
The funny thing is, Sophie, my father, he's actually my late father, he actually wanted me to be a lawyer. And at the time, I could not imagine anything more removed from my way of thinking about life and about all the things I wanted as a teenager. And the funny thing is, I've almost come full circle, because now a lot of what I do is due diligence. I work with, legalities and regulations, and this is all part of what I do. I actually thought about doing a degree in a mining law course, and I was really considering that for a while because it's such a fascinating area. So yes, he probably, your parents sometimes know you better than you know yourself. I think that's fair to say. And in that case, it was a good moment, it was hard to hear, like these things often are when you're full of willful teenage, ambition, and you think you know best. But actually, I'm glad that this is where it's been, and I think now it's safe to say that jewellery and all it entails is really in my veins, and I can't imagine a career in anything else.
You were trained obviously as a jeweler. You set up your own brand and had this focus on sustainability. At the time, 2006, not many jewelers were doing this. How challenging was that to combine both running your own brand and trying to focus on all these elements of sustainability and seeing that through for the first time?
It was incredibly challenging. It was almost impossible. At times, there were moments where I really questioned my sanity, I suppose, in trying to embark on this, because had it not been for my naivety, actually, I wouldn't have done so. The fact that and I think the other thing is that I am a very optimistic person. And sometimes that is a great characteristic. And other times it's hell on wheels, because you always think it can get better, it can get better, if I just do this, maybe I can make this better. And I think part of our design training as well is always that, that sort of perfectionism, but that drive for, just what if, and that curiosity. So those things were just, even when I was sitting there and I had 50p at the end of the week to my name, and I was thinking, oh, this is a really tough gig, and it was incredibly, financially, it was a huge risk, and it was incredibly difficult to keep going, and and I used to joke, because I'm quite small, and I used to say, it's okay, I don't need to eat much, but it's true. I mean, actually, there were times it was almost worse than being a student, because at the same time you had to go out and present, and you had to look like you were super successful and doing everything right, and trying to really create this brand. As a young person, I look back and I think, gosh, thank goodness that I had art school to teach me how to do all those things, really, and to be able to rely on putting on a show, if you like, because that largely, for certainly the first 2 years, was really, had to be a real belief that this was going to change, and that the world was going to change. And I went to a jewellery show, first of all, when I first exhibited, and I branded it as ethical jewellery. And the first show I did, people were coming over to me and they were like, what does that mean? What does ethical jewellery mean? And in the industry at that point, ethics was still very much aligned with disclosure. And the understanding was that if you were ethical, it just meant that you were accurate in your disclosures and you weren't misleading, or, in terms of gem quality and that side of things. So there was a bit of confusion about what I meant. And then when I explained what I meant, people were either just so confused about how you could change this and how this could be different, or maybe a little bit intrigued. But often there was just such a misunderstanding about it. And I had somebody come up to me and say, I can get you diamonds. I can get you ethical diamonds. And I said, oh, really? At that point, I didn't have any diamonds. I only had aquamarine, because that was all I could source for my very first show. And that was the only gemstone I had. It was either gold or gold with aquamarines. And so this chap coming onto my stand and telling me he was going to get me ethical diamonds was super exciting. And I said, well, where do these diamonds come from? And he said, well, from London. And I sort of blinked at him a few times, and I said, the Great Kimberlite pipe that runs under the Thames. I said, go away. He was just sort of, but they do come from London. Of course, I can go anywhere in London and buy my own diamonds, if I want to, but that doesn't tell me where they're from, where they're sourced from, where do they originate? And he couldn't quite get his head around that. So there was little funny things like that. They're funny now, but at the time they were infuriating, because here I was giving everything my all, trying to get this out, and people just didn't always get it. Thankfully, some people did get it, in no small part by the fact that the Blood Diamond film launch coincided with really that time when I was launching the brand, which I think people thought maybe I had some sort of inside knowledge about that, and actually I didn't. But what I had done was I'd done trend forecasting for years as head of design. So I knew that this conscientious consumerism was a mega trend. I was 100% certain of that. How that was going to manifest itself for the jewellery industry, I wasn't so sure, but here I was going to try and see how far I could take it as a low risk individual, if you like, as somebody who could take that on. But I met other people. I met people like Greg Valerio. I met Michael Hoare, who was at the time the CEO of the NAG, because that was before the BGA and the NAG became one. So he was again a fellow graduate from art school, and really understood what I was trying to do and was wonderfully supportive. And he said, look, I think we want to bring people together on this. And, he'd been working lots of different projects as well within the business. So we talked a lot, and Greg and Michael and I decided that we would try and put together this committee. And we had Estelle Levin involved, and we had lots of really just people who just got it. And we said, right, let's all get together. And then we were able to have roundtables with other people in the industry and bring them in and get their ideas and their input on how this could work and what could we change and what should we change first. So yeah, it was a great melting pot and a creative time, actually.
When I teach about sustainability, I often mention that today the word sustainability is used both in business for saying that a business is going to survive for the next 10 years and talking about sustainable practices, the use of materials. It's still a confusing term. Like the way we use it is confusing, and I'm not surprised you had these things happen to you where ethics were not thought of in the way that you were trailblazing with your business. You end up then consulting on the subject for a range of clients, including jewelry brands. What have been the most interesting and challenging projects to work on as part of your consultancy?
One of the most interesting ones was probably when I was approached by two ladies who they lived in Scotland, but they'd grown up in Pakistan. And they wanted to basically create a jewellery product from emeralds, which were produced in Pakistan. Now, I knew a little bit about the emeralds from Pakistan, from the Swat Valley region. I didn't know in great depth, but I knew that they were beautiful when they were small. They got rather saturated when you go up to sort of bigger sizes, but this sort of small sizes can be absolutely exquisite. So I knew that they were quite desirable, but obviously there was all the issues of the Taliban, and that region was badly affected. So it was something that they wanted to do. But on top of that, what was even more enticing about this almost impossible project was to source these emeralds from this region and somehow create a jewellery brand from that, was that they wanted women to be empowered in the process. And they insisted that women had to be absolutely involved in this supply chain, ideally at the mine level, but they would accept other states, other parts of the supply chain. So their ideal was to have this sort of women mining, women cutting and polishing, manufacturing, and then they had this idea for the brand. So that was a really challenging one. It was fascinating, and it's one of the probably most rewarding ones in terms of the fact that, I managed to put that supply chain together. I managed to work with experts on the ground to go and actually do the due diligence to go out and grade the gemstones themselves from different mines, from different cutting facilities. And in the end, we had a fantastic partnership with a gentleman who had set up a cutting workshop in Islamabad. Now, as you know, in gemstones, most often you're looking for calibrated, a brand is looking for a calibrated stone size. If you're looking at local cutting, that's really not possible usually. They're just not calibrated in the way that they are if they go through one of these gem hubs like Bangkok, or if they're going through these big cutting houses. So trying to get something that was going to be calibrated so that they weren't just making one-off pieces, but they could make a collection which was repeatable was quite difficult. And trying to get the consistency, as you know, with any gemstone, but when you're only sourcing from one source and you're saying we need the consistency of color and quality and cut, and they need to be calibrated sizes, it was quite an ask. So they hadn't come from a jewellery background at all. So I had to sort of be the one to to tell them that this was the chat. Here's where the problem lies, but let's try. And it took a while, but anyway, we built it, and we had this gentleman who had actually trained and worked in Thailand and Bangkok for a number of years, and then returned to Islamabad, created a company, and had actively recruited women graduates as his as his gem cutters and the polishers, because he felt that they were diligent and precise, and they had all the qualities that really he wanted in his gem cutters. He was very supportive of them. He had various programs of, supporting childcare and really trying to make it easy for them to attend work as their lives progressed as well. So he was quite supportive of that. And when we told him what we were doing, by that time he had about an 80% female workforce. And it was a really brilliant sort of breakthrough. But I also spoke to women who were mining in regions in Pakistan, little collectives that had been set up, and I learned so much about the country and about some of the challenges, really, I suppose, that the miners had experienced and that women experienced in trying to be involved in this supply chain. So it was a fantastic opportunity, very informative, very challenging sometimes, but in the end we managed to build it, and we managed to succeed in the task. And then I suppose the other two things that are interesting, that are probably, I don't know if I'm the only person, but certainly I'm one of the only people to have worked with 2 gold mines in the UK. So that's my other quite unusual claim to fame, I suppose, because I worked first of all with Scott Gold from back in 2007, when they had applied for planning permission. They were just beginning to really, they were still at the exploration stage, really, and they were sort of trying to pull all the information together. But they applied for planning, and I'd assumed they would get it. I thought there's no reason why they wouldn't. The community were very supportive. They had everything going for them. And then they didn't get planning permission. And that's sort of part of when my consultancy started, because I started consulting to them about what the downstream supply chain looked like and what it needed, and working with them really on trying to deliver that as well, so that we could bring some of the gold to jewellers in Scotland to be able to use in their products. That started back then, and now at the moment I work with Gold Mines of Wales, which is a fantastic, again, not currently mining, not currently in the extractive production phase, still in that early-ish stage of development, still beginning to find out what they've got on the ground and how they're going to work towards production. But very successful recent news is that they produced 3 1-ounce gold coins, and they sold those for, I think it was £60,000 in total for those 3 1-ounce coins. So there's definitely been some lovely highlights along the way as well.
That's really impressive. I mean, the sound of gold from Wales, and that we could control how that's mined and in a way be much closer to that process, sounds really great. Very interesting project to work on.
Well, local supply chains are obviously part of sustainability, having less transport, having a bit more control, as you say, over the working conditions that take place. Obviously, we have strong environmental regulation in this country as well. Both the mines have worked very, very hard on, sometimes in quite challenging situations, regarding the fact of where they're located, and it's not been a straightforward process. It's certainly very, very carefully considered at each stage, and every decision they make has to be very, very carefully considered. So it's been fascinating to have an up-close view of that and sort of get into it in a sort of micro level, rather than in usually these projects you're sort of sitting back. It's maybe something that you're dealing with a bit more remotely, or maybe you go on a field trip, but you can't sort of really get quite as under the skin of it, I suppose, as it's allowed me to be. And I think as well, I grew up in a mining community in Scotland. It wasn't very glamorous. It was coal mining, not gold or diamonds, but still in all, actually that industry is just fascinating as a sector. And all of the geology, the knowledge and the intricacies of it and the nuances of it, I just find, again, fascinating. It really makes me quite excited when I get to go on a field trip to the mine and I get my steel toe cap boots on and my hard hat, and there's a real thrill to being able to do those things.
Maybe talking about localized production, but then looking at a different side of the industry. The growing of diamonds has been something that we've seen appear in the UK, and you have served as the sustainability chair for the International Diamond Growers Association. And last month I discussed that this remains a sort of divisive subject in the industry. What are your thoughts on lab-grown diamonds or in general lab-grown gemstones from a sustainability point of view?
It's a really good question, Sophie, and you're right, it is quite divisive. And I think there has to be a lot of conversation, and I don't think we should shy away from things that are, I suppose, disruptive. Again, coming from creative backgrounds, you should sort of expect those sorts of things and welcome them almost, because it does change perception and it does ultimately offer consumers a choice. And I welcome that. I don't welcome some of the claims that have been made, which I think are confusing and sometimes conflicting and sometimes actually just really untrue. So some of those claims that don't have that consumer in their focus make it difficult, and I think make it unnecessarily difficult for that sector to really thrive in the way that it might. I've talked a lot about this already, and my role there, as you say, was to focus on sustainability and to really, I suppose, speak to truth to power when it comes to that, and be quite open and say, these claims potentially are misleading as far as consumers go, unless you can evidence them. And what I'm talking about here are claims like, that lab-grown diamonds or lab-grown stones are more responsible than mined goods, than natural goods. Where's the evidence for that? Until we actually have absolutely crystal clear evidence and data to support that, that claim is very much, challengeable, shall we say. So we don't have a huge amount of data necessarily, even in the mined industry, in the mined goods for diamonds. So it does make it difficult to start to capture all of that and then to start to make a comparison. It's very difficult to do that, and I accept that. So rather than saying that we're not doing anything and we're just going to sort of wait, I think there needs to be steps to be taken. What the laboratory grown diamond industry can do is they can capture the data, and a lot of people in that sector are from tech backgrounds. So that shouldn't be that challenging over the next few years to start to really build up a real sense of where that is, where the energy use comes from. That's a big one. Yes, okay, you might not be digging up tons of earth, but when you're doing a high pressure, high temperature process, who's providing your energy and how? And is it a fossil fuel? These are questions that go right back. There are some great producers, lab-grown producers that I spoke to who were very switched on, talking about solar power and talking about, having their supply chain as responsibly managed as possible and really looking at those things in great detail. But there are others who quite honestly jump on the bandwagon and just start making spurious claims. And, it's for me, it's difficult because to have trust in the industry, the consumer needs to be able to evidence things. We need to be able to have these claims as crystal clear as possible. And even before, when I had Fifi Bijou, I couldn't really evidence those. This was pre RJC days. But even then, I was capturing everything that I had. I was uploading it. There was a gentleman in Antwerp who had set up something called Open Source Minerals. And it was a very early, I suppose, blockchain almost style system, just a digital capture of where everything came from and evidencing everything. And that's sort of where we have to be if we're going to make those claims. Then you have to then say, okay, let's be transparent about this. Let's try and do that. And obviously this was back in 2006, I was doing that. Things have got much more sophisticated now, but also so have the consumers and their expectations. So let's not forget that whilst all these technological changes are evolving, so are our consumers. And so we have to be able to sort of match those two things together. So I think it's great to have discourse. I think it's great to have discussion and to raise these topics and to explore the value proposition around them, because it does not necessarily equate. It may not be that my lab-grown diamonds equate in the perception of the consumer in the way that mined goods do. At the same time, it may evolve that those two threads do very much come together. And I think the mined diamond industry is going to have to potentially accept that. So it goes two ways. But it's a really interesting space. It's not there yet. We're not sort of looking at it and saying, here's the conclusion of this. It's still emerging and it's still evolving. And I think as long as we can keep having clear dialogue, not mudsling at each other, not sort of, try and do one-upmanship about it, but just be honest and clear in what those products look like, what the supply chains look like, what the issues for that supply chain are like as well, and what they represent. And then, it's about making informed choices for the consumer, and they have the ability to do so.
You regularly write for trade press as well, and in fact, general press. I mean, it can be read by the general public as well. And you've recently sort of covered greenwashing and green rinsing as well, a term I had actually only heard once before. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is greenwashing, what is green rinsing, and why are these practices so damaging to sustainability initiatives?
I think it's going back to what I was just saying about the consumer and about making sure that, or not necessarily the consumer, but it could be stakeholders in this case that we might be talking about, and people being able to make informed decisions. So if you're greenwashing, you're basically misleading about the claims that you're making. You're claiming to do something responsibly when in fact, you may not be doing anything different to a standard supply chain. Or you're claiming to achieve a goal, which is something that isn't really a goal. Green rinsing is where you change that goal. So we're halfway through, you say, actually, that isn't what our target is. It's this. And you maybe, reduce it or just delete it or change it. So that's green rinsing. There's green lighting, which is where you're sort of virtue signaling. So look at all this wonderful stuff we're doing. Ignore the stuff over there. Maybe ignore the bad labor practices that we have. Maybe ignore the environmental damage that we do, but look over here to this, charitable foundation that we've set up, for example. So that's a real sort of where you're pointing your spotlight and looking at what you are doing, neglecting to mention what you're not doing or what harm there may be in your supply chain. So for me, it's really important that we look at this. And I go back to UN Sustainable Development Goals, because if you can look at those, they're all interlinked. So it's not like these are all separate tanks of objectives. They're all interlinked. They're interconnected. But really, if you can look at those and see where in your supply chain, where am I hitting some of those, which ones are my priorities, and which ones perhaps am I either not hitting or am I contributing in a negative way to. So if you, for example, are using materials that use a lot of water, and you're using a lot of water resource, for example, and you're not sure about how well managed that is, or what your systems could be, or could you change that? Could you start recycling water in circulation in your manufacturing? Different aspects of it, different things that you can do. But really, if you look at that as your framework, then you can see where is there positive contributions, where is there no contribution, really, it's sort of a moot point, and where is negative aspects likely to lead or are already leading. And then just be very, very honest. That's really what it comes down to, is if you can report on those things and have the courage to say, I can do this, I can say this, this, and this. These are the good things. I can't tell you about where this bit comes from because I don't know, but I'm working on it. And these are the things that we're aware actually are doing harm, but these are our targets. Because here's how we're going to address those things. And if we can't do it alone, then here's who we're going to collaborate with in order to change those things. So really just a complete honest appraisal of the issues that exist within your own supply chain, exist within your product or your company, and they exist for everybody. They're slightly different. The levels of one thing changes over one, depending on which product it is. Obviously, there's variations, but really that's what we're looking for, is just that level of honesty, transparency, and I say accountability, but it is because then people can say, okay, so you said that you were going to do this in 2 years' time, and have you done that? Yes, we have, but maybe we've exceeded it. Who knows? Maybe we've done even better. Great talking points, great things to share, but not just marketing, not just somebody sitting there with a marketing pen going, what can I find on the internet and write down as something that sounds like this company could do, or would appeal to the consumer, when we don't actually have any basis for making that claim. So yes, it's a sore point for me, because coming from Fifi Bijou and having worked so hard, as I've described earlier, to have companies later on jumping on the bandwagon and claiming things and saying, oh, I do this, and no, you don't do that, or this is no different to any other supply chain, it just made me cross. And I was always so happy when one of the brands would contact me and say, how do we do this? we're really interested and we want to do better, or we think actually we have this problem in our supply chain. How can we change that? So that for me was just so refreshing, and so much more how you want things to evolve and to work, and much more useful to society and consumers.
Yeah, and if you have companies that pretend and therefore look much better and then attract the customers, then it's not making it a positive environment for people to be honest. So it's challenging, isn't it, on multiple levels if you have people not playing by the now well-established sort of guidelines or rules.
And I think too, for the staff, for employees, it's very much something that you can see the light that's coming on in the eyes with, I've worked in teams before where I've gone, and obviously as a consultant, I might dive into an existing team and I'm there to support them. But as you start doing maybe the training and, going through some modules with them, and suddenly they're quite impassioned about it, and they're quite inspired. And then you've enabled those members of the team to go and carry on with what they need to do and to understand it. But those enablers have to happen. So there's that part. And then the other part is that you've got, the cost savings. And let's be honest, that's a big part of it. It's actually looking at where can you reduce your energy costs, perhaps, or where can you find alternative ways that, perhaps you're not having to spend so much on shipping or an insurance, bringing it all the way around the world, because we're talking high value goods, right? So there are always aspects of that can tick boxes on both fronts. So not only from an employee engagement, but also perhaps potentially from a cost saving or a efficiencies point of view. And there's a lot to love about it. It's not all just, it's not all just about doing the right thing because you should. Yes, that's a huge part of it, but actually it builds momentum and you can start to create a real drive for this. And once you see that momentum happening in companies, that's when I feel like, okay, my job here is done. I can step back, and you've got the teams sort of all enabled. They know what they're doing. They're implementing changes. They understand where the goals are. They're clear about what their sort of North Star. This is where we're headed. This is our timeline. This is what we're going to do. And they've got their milestones in place. And it's like a well-oiled machine. Fantastic. And these things don't not exist in companies. What I always find is, or almost always, is that when I go into a company and I'll say, well, this is the practice that we would recommend for A, B, or C. And they'll say, oh, we actually do that already. And I say, that's great. Have you written it down? No. Okay. So one of the first things can just be, let's write down, let me sit with you, talk me through, when a consignment comes in, or what do you do? And we go through it point by point and really drill into it. And that's where you actually start to capture some of this evidence. It's not always that people aren't doing the right thing. They're just not always recording it.
You've zoomed into companies, but in various roles, you have also looked at the jewelry sector, perhaps from a bird's eye perspective. So, in your roles as chair of the Jewellery Ethics Committee UK and Ireland, 2011 to 2015, and then ethics manager for the Gemological Association of Great Britain, you mentioned 2013 to 2016. You have taken a broader look at sustainability in the industry, and what were the ambitions at the time in these roles, and are there any changes you would like to see materialized in the near future so we have a more sustainable industry?
I think some of the changes that took place then, if we look at gold, for example, as a product, we worked then at, so Fair Trade was just beginning to think about, could they put the Fair Trade label on gold products? We had those sorts of initiatives. We had the World Gold Council looking at what could they do with the large scale mining sector and how should that look. And then we had the London Bullion Market Association saying, well, what can we do in the refining sector to make sure that bullion is as responsible as possible? So all of these things were already sort of beginning to flow through. And I think you get this sort of sense of a community and an energy around a subject. So once these conversations started to happen, then the momentum built. And it's a little bit like turning a tanker around. You've got these tiny little increments all happening in the background, and you can't always see the progress very easily. And then all of a sudden, 5 years in, I look and I say, wow, look what's changed. People are actually talking to each other here. People are actually thinking about how they can include artisanal small-scale mining in their supply chains. There's projects happening where they're really, really trying very hard to do so, although it's challenging. And we see some of the biggest mining companies saying we want to do something brilliant here. We want to be the best. We don't want to sort of be associated with damage or to do anything that would be harmful. So how can we do that? And they're really thinking so critically around it and so consistently. So that for me is a real win, when those conversations were not just happening, but actually we started to see the seeds of change, the little sprouts coming up through the ground of projects that might emerge or changes that could be made. So that's been really interesting. And then I think the other part is probably the coloured gemstone part, as you mentioned with Gem A. And that's a sort of funny one, because coloured gems back at that point were really largely ignored. And it was strange, because there was me thinking, well, we've got diamonds and we've got gold. What about coloured gems? And again, it didn't seem to really be a big focus. So when Gem A approached me and said, would you come and first of all, they were part of the ethics committee, and then they said, look, we actually want to do some more work on this specifically for coloured gems. Would you come and work with us? Perfect. What a fantastic team. And again, you've got these scientists, you've got this sort of forensic science of gemology, people so passionate about what they do, and what a brilliant team they were. So working with them to sort of educate them on, actually, this is the mining part of things, this is where things happen, and they're educating me on the different aspects of gemology as well. And it was a really exciting time to work on those things, because the gem mining sector is 80-90% artisanally small scale mined, produced. So it's very different from gold or from diamonds, and it's a very complex architecture. It's quite fragmented, and it's quite fascinating, and it's got its own little nuances. It's sort of amazingly beautiful and complicated, but it's also existed like that for hundreds and hundreds of years, possibly even thousands of years, without being formalized, without being a vertically integrated system. And it's existed. So why has it existed? So that was really where I wanted to dive into, was, well, okay, it's not perfect, and we know it's not perfect. And of course, there's illicit trade and there's the problems. But for the most part, the gem trade, everybody was trying to just get on with businesses. It was all about relationships. And I think if you look at an example of a human supply chain, really, of this, humanizing it, the coloured gemstone industry is a really strong case for that. And there's a lot of lessons, I think, that other precious mineral supply chains could learn from those existing systems, from those relationships that are well established. But it's, as I say, it's not perfect, and it is slightly out with some of the other supply chains that we look at. But that was really interesting to learn, to understand more, and to bring everybody together again to talk about it, and to see where are the problems, who causes the problems, and what should we do about the problems. And most often, the people that were causing the problems didn't always know they were causing the problems. So until that was sort of pointed out, and you were sort of addressing this with them and saying, actually, this isn't great. This isn't great, because this is making perhaps a weak spot in the otherwise great supply chain. Can you do anything about that? So obviously, if it's a criminal gang, then that's not going to work. But for most people, the intentions could be motivated to do the right thing. If it was a small enough change, if it wasn't going to ruin their business, sure. And I found such a lovely community of people who were very willing to embrace this and think about it almost like professional development, because it's that sort of industry where people do want to do well, and they do want to do the best that they can, and it's quite competitive to be seen and to be doing the best you can. So it was a lovely thing to be part of as well. And I think there's been a lot has changed over the past 20 years, but often it's happened in sort of 5-year tranches of progress. It's not all happened steadily. So sometimes there have been moments of great frustration, and sometimes there's been moments where it's been all about celebrating and looking at how far things have come.
For the future, what do you think are the key sort of areas you'd like to see change happen still?
I think there's a few things. I'm very interested in the sort of Indigenous rights piece, and in some of the issues around the existing supply chain where we might look at it from a different side, I think. So for me now, I'm looking at it thinking, actually, the smaller producers, not necessarily just the artisanal ones, but the smaller ones are very agile, and they might actually be able to respond much more quickly than some of these big, large companies and producers. So how do we then make sure that everybody's working together again? Because sometimes that happens and a bit of the supply chain sort of speeds up and the rest of it hasn't quite caught up yet. So for me, that's an interesting part. I think looking at inclusion generally, looking at women and how we include women, particularly still in mining. I mean, I looked at a photograph from years and years ago with my son recently, and I said, "Oh, look, that was taken. It was popped up," and he went, "Why are you the only girl there, Mum?" And I looked at it and I went, "Oh, so I am." Now, I must have been to so many conferences and situations and workplaces where I was the only woman. And it actually had genuinely never occurred to me. It had never been pointed out. No, it had never been an issue. I was never unwelcome or, there was never a problem. But the fact is I was quite underrepresented. So I think that's a big factor. And I think how women can interact in not just in the jewellery, not just in the retail, not just in design, but actually throughout the supply chain, right from the mining all the way through, that I think will make further positive contributions. Seen it in mining communities where women start to become involved in the community and positive changes really start to take hold there. Even I mentioned Pakistan. Some of the areas in Pakistan which were least affected by Taliban rule and extremism were areas where there were strong women's craft groups. I don't mean the women were strong. I mean, there was a strong establishment of these craft groups. So it wasn't termed industry, but it was about craft and about, being able to have an activity there that was a sort of linchpin in society. So I think women have a huge role to play on that front. And I also think human rights. I think we're in an area now, we're in a time at the moment which I don't know that any of us really expected to be. And I don't know if I thought at this point of my life I would be looking back thinking things are potentially worse than they were 20 years ago. But there's a real danger that is sliding back so far, so fast. So I really think we have to keep our eye firmly on that and not let it go, because if we lose our pride in what's been achieved in human rights and in those positive changes in societies, then we are in very dangerous territory. And I think we're going to be worse off than the Victorians in terms of those divides that occur. So that's a really important one for me. And I think overall that's where my eyes are firmly on the subject.
For any starting jewelers listening, it can be quite daunting to think, okay, I'm starting a brand. You hear all the big problems that are going on. Climate anxiety is real. Students sometimes feel like they can't produce anymore because they're worried about their impact. Do you have any tips for any starting jeweler on how to contribute to a more sustainable industry, maybe with smaller steps rather than the big actions?
I think there are always small steps. And I think it is about really, even if you don't make any changes in your supply chain immediately, get to know your supply chain and ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Be polite. Always be polite. And you usually will actually get more information than you have expected. I think part of the problem that we have in, not just in our industry, but it happens in a lot of other ones too, but I notice that different parts of the industry don't always talk to each other. They talk to themselves and they don't always talk to each other. And so if you can be the person that actually speaks to each person in the supply chain or each part of the supply chain and begins to actually understand how that works, that's really powerful. If you're a creative person who can do that, that's even more powerful, because you then might actually have the vision to see where you can make differences or where other people can make differences or how it can change. So don't be shy of that and don't sort of embrace that creativity as well. I think keep the conversations going. And one thing on that I would love to say, Sophie, as well, is come along to the Jewellery show, because I'm hosting day 2 of the Jewellery show in London. That's on the 1st of September. It's taking place at Olympia. And I've got a whole day of panels with fantastic speakers who are going to come and talk about sustainability, talk about gold mining in the UK, really interesting subjects, things like phytomining, which I'm not even going to explain in this podcast, but it's fascinating. I think we're going to see lots of solutions coming around, whether it's bioplastics, bioengineering, looking at how refining can happen without the use of chemicals. We're going to see so many things like this emerging in the next few years and over the next decade, that actually having your finger on the pulse on those things and knowing what is possible might not be readily available yet, and it might not be the dominant way that the larger industry works, but knowing what's possible and seeing those opportunities, then you're much more aware when they start to come through of how you can adopt those. Or perhaps there's a way as a creative person that you can actually grow some of these ideas yourself and participate in a much fuller way. But the first thing is you have to just start listening, start talking, start listening.
Much looking forward to the jewelry show, talking about my own research and waste as well, and where waste sits and urban mining. And we can look to solutions in different ways. Yeah, getting to know your supply chain is super important, but also looking at, like you said, your practices and what is it that you are producing, how and where are you throwing things away, and where does that then go, is also quite an interesting opportunity. What could you do with those things? There are opportunities there that I think could be inspirational. You run your own consultancy, Johnston Resources. What are you currently working on? And could you share anything we may be looking forward to seeing, reading from you in the near future?
There's not much I can share ahead of it, unfortunately, Sophie. It's not something that I can usually do, is tell you what clients are about to do or what's happening on that level. So usually when I'm talking about things, I can only talk about them after they've existed in the public domain and after they're already out there. Part of my consultancy, I suppose, is being great at being a secret squirrel when it comes to those sorts of opportunities. So there's not much I can tell you about that, but I'm still working with Gold Mines of Wales, and they've always got exciting things happening in the background. But, and as I say, until they're sort of in the public domain, it's not something that I would share. So yeah, I guess it's just watch this space, and as soon as it becomes available, I can start to talk about it. But yes, at the moment, that's where we're at.
And where do you share things?
LinkedIn probably is the best one. So I usually post things on there.
Our world is facing a range of challenges, and sustainable practices and mindsets are of utmost importance. The jewelry industry's impact on the environment remains substantial, and all of us can make it less so. This is, however, not always so easy to envision, and we need expertise in the subject to lead the way and share good practice. So thank you, Vivien, for taking your time, sketching out your own inspirational journey, sharing good advice, and for joining me for the BAJ podcast. We are really grateful for your efforts and for your time today.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and to hear about the work that you're doing too.
Next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. For now, this was Sophie Boons for the BAJ podcast episode titled A Sustainable Industry with Vivien Johnston Glass. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.